Right, Brendan, you'll advance the slides.
Yep, I will do that.
Sounds perfect. Thanks, everybody, members of the Planning and Zoning Commission and the staff. I'm Mark White, the project manager for the team that's working with the city to update its Unified Development Ordinance. You see Brennan right there, and we have Felix Landry with Urbex Solutions, who's here with us tonight and is going to present us some concepts on how some of your zoning metrics relate to fiscal sustainability, which is a big part of your comprehensive plan policies. Next slide, please. So what we're going to talk about is Felix is going to cover the bulk and block standards and his background on how that, how some of the differentials there relate to the city's both gross revenue output from new development as well as net revenues, and what that means in terms of how we look at revising the metrics in your zoning districts. And I'm going to cover briefly, Felix has a lot to go through. I'm going to cover briefly some of the things we are writing, busy writing in what we call Module 2, so your residential design, home occupations, including some new concepts that you heard from IDA, revisions to processes, and then sign regulations. So next slide. Felix, you want to take it away and talk about your bulk and block standard approach?
Certainly, I will run away with it.
Thank you.
So thanks for having me and having us. I'm excited to be here and chat about this stuff. We've got some really fun data to go over. We're going to be talking about bulk standards and block lengths. So we're going to cover bulk standards first and do a little bit of review on the revenue stuff, but I'll be fast on the review side. So when we talk about bulk standards, we're really talking about things in your district standards that are going to be lot size, setback, building heights, density, things that really affect the building envelope of a site and how high it can go and how much improved space you can get on the site. Brennan, go ahead and hit the next slide. So you can see here on this table, which you guys have seen before, a lot of the metrics that deal with your development patterns. What we're going to focus on real briefly is just that revenue per acre metric, which is surrounded in green, and the floor area ratio metric surrounded in orange on the very end. So revenue per acre, as you can imagine and have heard before, is going to decline as your lot sizes get bigger because your lot sizes tend to outpace your built environment as they get bigger. And so your bulk standards can really be cumulatively kind of wrapped up and viewed through a metric called a floor area ratio. And that's the metric on the far right. It's basically just the occupiable space, the total occupiable space divided by the lot area. So if you have 1,000 square foot building that's single story, it's going to be 1,000 square feet over the total lot area. If you have 1,000 square foot building footprint, but it's 3 stories, you're going to divide the total space, 3,000 square feet, over the lot area, and it's going to make the floor area ratio go up. So while you can't really codify floor area ratio as a standard, it's really indicative of what your bulk standards are producing. And so something else you can clearly see on this table that I want to point out before we move on is that if you look at the 2 columns in between the revenue per acre and the floor area ratio, you have average improvement area first and then average lot size. And what I want you to notice is that average improvement area is the occupiable space. And the average lot size is exactly that. It's the average size of the lot for these different lot size categories and land uses. And so what you can see on the single family homes here, as you go up in lot size, the average lot size goes up significantly from 5,600 to 7,500 to 13,000, 23,000. But then when you look at the average improvement area, the occupiable space, which is where most of your revenue is coming from, it doesn't really go up that much. It goes from 2,600 to 3,000 to 3,500, 3,200. And that's just really indicative of typically single family homes fall within a pretty predictable size range. They're going to fall somewhere between 1,000 to 4,000 square feet on average. The vast majority of them are. And so as those lot sizes increase, they really start to outpace the built environment. And there's a similar trend with the commercial lots below there. Go ahead, Brennan. So these charts basically just illustrate that principle. I think the numbers tell the story a bit clearer. The gold lines are your average lot area. The green line is your improvement area for single family and for commercial. And you can see the gold line really outpaces the green line. And so that just means as the lot size gets past a certain point, the size will increase, but your revenue per acre is going to decrease because your value producing improved area is not increasing with it. Go ahead, Brennan. And so these charts just illustrate that nice relationship between the floor area ratio and the revenue per acre. So on the left is a pretty traditional chart comparing revenue per acre to the improved value of the lot, the overall value of the structure, and they don't correlate well. They go in different directions. But the chart on the right, the revenue per acre is the gold line, the bars represent the floor area ratio. They relate really well, so there's a strong relationship. Next slide. And these are the commercial equivalents of the same chart. So you can see the one on the left, the line doesn't necessarily follow the bars. It separates from them pretty dramatically in some cases. But in the chart on the right, the line, the revenue per acre, follows the changing height of the bars, which is the floor area ratio. Okay, Brennan. Okay, so these are just illustrations driving that same principle home. You have not too differently sized single-family residences on dramatically different sized lots. You can see on the tables at the bottom, the floor area ratio is the very bottom number. It goes from 0.05 to 0.13 to 0.64. That's a pretty dramatic change for a stat like that. And the revenue per acre, which is the next stat up from the bottom in parentheses, changes proportionately with it. So it goes from 609 per acre to 1900 per acre to 8700 per acre. Go ahead, Brendan. You can see the same trend across all the development patterns. So these are multifamily homes in the same part of Texas. You can see as the floor area ratio changes, the revenue per acre also changes with it. Go ahead, Brendan. And then the same thing can be said for downtown. So downtowns are neat because, you know, just from above, they look the same. They're on grids. Most of the block is built out. But what's interesting about this example is the floor area ratio is dramatically different. In the first one, you have largely a historic one-story downtown, and the floor area ratio is 0.57. It gives you $4,300 per acre. And the one on the right is a newer development in the same downtown, and it's got a 2.31 floor area ratio and a significantly higher revenue per acre at 17,000 per acre. So go ahead, Brennan. So just to refresh us, these are the bulk standards. So setbacks, building height, density, lot sizes. In this example, in this visualization, you can see the two-story houses and the single-story house. They're all in the same size lots. Those two-story houses are going to generate pretty close to double the revenue per acre. And so there's something to be said about restricting building heights or requiring a certain amount of building heights, letting that building envelope expand to create more buildable space. Go ahead, Brennan. And so you can see in this example, this is much more of a downtown block or a business district block. This just based purely on the amount of built space, the lack of unbuilt space really is going to generate vastly more revenue per acre than the other visualization is. But it's abiding by the same types of metrics. You still have setbacks, you still have densities, you still have maximum or minimum building heights. They're just set to different levels. Go ahead, Brendan. Okay, so these are the fun charts. We're pretty new, so we're getting into some things that, a lot of fiscal analysis is done for comp plans, but not a ton of it has been applied to zoning codes. So we're running into some new data exercises, which is lots of fun. So what you see here is a scatter plot. The dots represent parcels in the city of Fate, and they are color-coded by land use, which you can see along the bottom. The yellow are single family, the red is commercial, green is ag, so on. I will note the blue is called residential inventory. What that means is it is a lot that has been subdivided, and there is some stage of construction going on for the home on that lot. So it might be just a foundation, it might be 80% done, it's somewhere in there. And so you can see that along the x-axis, along the bottom, we have our lot sizes. It's ranged from 2,500 square feet out to around 217,000 square feet, which is going to be 5 acres. And then along the x-axis, you have your revenue per acre. And so you can see all of the drama is really happening on the left side of the chart. So the lines going down the chart are logarithmic trend curves. So the red line goes with the commercial lots. The black line in the middle is following the residential lots. And the line furthest inside is, I think that one's following the vacant lots, which are the gray dots all along the bottom. So you can see that when you go from left to right, the biggest drops and changes of value are all going to be in the small end. So going from a 10,000 square foot lot to an 8,000 square foot lot is going to be a much more dramatic change in fiscal analysis than going from a 2 acre lot to a 2.5 acre lot. Even though it's a bigger numeric change, the change in value isn't going to be as big as going from 10,000 to 8,000 square feet. Go ahead, Brennan. So what we're going to do here is we're going to kind of zoom in a little bit. So as we go through these charts, it's going to get, the range of lot sizes is going to shrink. So we just went from 5 acres to, it's about 2 acres. So when you shrink in, the dots start to separate a little bit on the small end, which you can tell. And you can start to see kind of humanity's need for order. You have a block of dots there around 22,500, which is half-acre lots. You have another little clump right past the 42,500 mark, which is 1 acre lots. And then you've got all the smaller subdivision lots towards the end. Go ahead, Brennan. So as we zoom in again, we're looking at everything between 2,500 square feet and 43,560 square feet, which is 1 acre. And you can start to see a bit more of a pattern show up. Go in one more time, Brennan. Okay, so now we're zoomed down to 12,000 square foot lots as the max. And outside of the clumping, you can start to see a different kind of pattern show up. So what you see are these vertical lines in the dots. And what those are representing is either a publicly enforced lot size minimum or a privately designated or designed lot size minimum for subdivisions. So you start seeing all these lots kind of line up on their common lot sizes. And you see those in the yellow dots that are lined up. You can also see that the revenue per acre is much stronger on the small end, like we've already seen in lots of other metrics. But what's also interesting is you can see all those blue dots kind of rising from the bottom as those houses get built up, which is pretty neat. So what does this mean? Go ahead and go forward, Brennan. So we're gonna isolate residential lots, and we're just gonna look at those dots. So that's the yellow. So it's the same lot size metric or lot size maximum at 12. That's at 10,000 square feet. And go ahead and go one more, Brennan. So this would be where your highest revenue lots would be if they were allowed by zoning. So they would fall into this 2,500 to 3,500 square foot lots that would fit inside the mixed use center land use category of the comp plan, which allows a couple of zoning districts in there. Now, single family homes aren't currently allowed in those zoning districts. But if you had standards for them, they would be your highest performing single-family homes by far. Go ahead and go forward one, Brennan. And so your next range of revenue per acre, according to the trend line, would fall somewhere in here, 3,500 to 5,000 square foot lots. Go ahead and go one more, Brennan. And then your next range, as far as land use categories go from the comp plan, is your suburban neighborhood. And they tend to fall in this category. So you do have lots of examples of lots that fit that suburban neighborhood. And there's a pretty good change across that. So it's only spanning from 5,000 square feet to 8,000 square feet. But the trend line goes from, move these pictures around. Let's see, it hits it right around 7,500 on the left side. And as it goes across, it drops down to about 4,500. So it's a pretty big decrease over a relatively small lot size segment. So what does this mean for zoning? Well, right now, most zoning codes go by a minimum lot size. Now that's typically going to allow everything to go as low performance as it wants to. You're basically putting the cap on your high earning potential. So you're capping it by a minimum lot size from going further up the revenue per acre spectrum. And that's that's fine. The lot sizes really depend on what kind of environment you want built. It just has a collateral effect on the revenue per acre. So when we think about zoning and doing lot sizes, if we're going to take a fiscal approach, it might make sense to target some of these fiscal areas and say, you know what, if we're going to look at our residential neighborhoods as like part of our investment portfolio, maybe it makes sense to target some high earning lot sizes and work that into the zoning code and say, you know what, we want 20% of our residential inventory to fall within $6,000 to $8,000 per acre revenue wise. And a metric like this will give you some idea of what lot size that means. Because again, the size of the houses going in there aren't going to change that much. It's not going to be that dramatic of a difference. It's just mostly going to be yard space. Go ahead, Brennan. So you can see a similar, we're going to zoom back out and see where those land use categories fall. So go one more. Okay, so that first one we saw is showing up the mixed use center. Go again, Brennan. And then your 3,500 to 5,000 square foot lots fall on this part of the line. Hit one more. And then there's your suburban neighborhood. So you can see there is a chunk of your current residential inventory that goes off to the right. But you can also see how high that revenue per acre trend line starts to go when you get into those smaller lot sizes. So even things like single family detached on really small lots in downtown areas, they're going to perform really well. They're just going to be tall and narrow typically. And if that's a format the city's comfortable with, that might be something to look into as we move forward in the zoning regulations. Go ahead, Brennan. Go ahead again. Let's get those squares up there. So you got your mixed use center. We zoomed out again. So we're back out to 5 acre. And you've got the 3 land use categories we've already seen. Go ahead, Brennan. And then you've got 2 more. So there's the rural neighborhood area, which spans 1 acre and up. And then you've got the rural reserve land use category, which spans 5 acres. So you can see you've got most zoning codes will have caps moving up the revenue per acre end. But if we're really taking a fiscal approach and thinking about investment, we might also want to cap or create a hard floor for that revenue per acre and maybe limit the amount of stuff that we have that's moving down that revenue per acre spectrum to the very low end. So something to think about. That is something that we can certainly do with the zoning code. It would be a bit unique, especially with the fiscal data to back it up, but it's very, it would be a very clear thing to justify and support with the fiscal analysis data. So that's something to think about. These are just ideas that we're want to bring to your attention, what you can do with the data and what you can do with your zoning code. But how far you want to go into it and how comfortable you are with it is just really up to you guys. And we'll take whatever lead you show us. I think that's the last. Go one more, Brennan. Yeah, so I do want to pause there and just see if there's any questions. So the bulk standards, well, I'll just see if there's any questions. I'll shut up for a second.
At this point, Felix, I have people shaking their heads no for questions.
All right. So just to recap, the bulk standards, when we're writing these standards for lot sizes and setbacks and building heights, there's opportunity in there to say, you know, maybe we want to have a lot size maximum in some of these districts to kind of set a floor on how low that revenue per acre can get. Maybe some of our downtown districts we want to have minimum 2-story construction just to elevate that revenue per acre. Maybe we want to minimize our setbacks or use a build to line on the front so that we can expand that buildable footprint and let people build more on the properties. And all that stuff will have to be weighed with parking requirements, with landscaping requirements, but it's certainly something we can show and I guess prove or justify with the fiscal analysis. And even at the very end of the day, if we don't, you know, push the envelope on the zoning requirements, we'll still be able to use the fiscal analysis just to give you an idea of the patterns that fate chooses to go with and to move forward with, what kind of impact they're going to have on the budget. So those are the bulk standards. So next we have block standards. So this one is even more what I would consider a little bit on the innovative side. So go ahead and move forward, Brendan. So we talked a lot about revenue in the last section, and that tends to be the focus of most discussions when it comes to fiscal analysis. But cost is really the other half of the coin and has a huge impact on how a lot of these metrics work out, either in favor or as a burden to the city. So I bring this up and I show this chart. This is one of the budget years for Fate. And you can see that police, as in most cities across the country, is the highest budget item. Public safety is almost always by far the highest budget item. Fire goes in there, so once Fate keeps growing, it gets to the fire department and it starts spreading across the city, that's going to start catching up with police eventually and take up the vast majority of most budget year cycles. And so what's the other thing that typically doesn't show up is streets. They're typically the most expensive thing a city maintains, but they just don't show, they're not fully funded most of the time. So they go into capital improvement programs for maintenance, and they just don't show up in the budget that much. But those three items, fire, police, and streets, take up the vast majority of money that cities spend on services and maintenance. That's important because those services are very geographically based. So they're not what I would call unit based. The police, we don't charge people for police calls. They're going to cost the same amount all year round if they're called once or if they're called 100 times, because you're paying full-time salaries and equipment for people to be available when they're needed. So the same thing is true with fire. The same thing is true with streets. We always want them there. We don't want them to just show up when we need them and can pay for them. They're always funded. And their cost footprint is set typically by service areas. So police and fire departments usually use response times. So their service areas are set. They're impacted by connectivity. The less connected your street network is, the smaller their service area is based on response time, and the higher your cost concentration is going to be. So go ahead and go to the next slide. Okay, so this gets us into street grid conversations, which is directly connected to your block lines. So what we're looking at here is what a lot of kind of urban planners would get excited about. It's a grid, it's downtown, it's connected and it's square. And it's great for service areas. So like when police and fire talk about their response times, you can get a bigger response time with a connected grid network. It allows you to go further in the same amount of time. And so what that allows you to do is spread that cost out over a larger area. And ideally that larger area is also generating more revenue, which is able to cover that cost a bit better. Go ahead and go to the next slide. Oh wait, go back to that first one. So a lot of times the discussion is around, small blocks are particularly in vogue right now. They're a lot more connected. They provide a lot more alternate routes, but they're also more expensive. That's more street. That's more public right-of-way. That's more maintenance. It's more infrastructure costs. And it also, if it's done poorly, it can start to shrink that response time area again because of the number of conflict points. So if you have to cross a street every 300 feet, you're not going to be able to go very far without slowing down and stopping. So there's another kind of block, the super blocks, that are typically frowned upon, but there are some advantages to it. So we're going to talk about the differences here and how that plays into fiscal analysis. Go to the next slide. Okay, so we have a visual exercise here. What you have on the top row is just a conceptual idea of a 400 by 400 block, which is a block size a lot of urban planners will get really excited about, 400 by 400 square feet. It's very easy to walk through. It's very connected. And then below it, you have a row of blocks that are twice as long and they're twice as wide and twice as tall. They're 800 by 800. And so just to get our minds wrapped around this idea of the fiscal footprint of this, what you have are these blocks, and the numbers that are next to them are showing if this block developed at different lot sizes. So in this case, across the top, you see 5,600 square foot lots, 7,500 square foot lots, 13,000 square foot lots, and so on. Those are the lot size, the average lot sizes from the different segments, lot size segments, which you see in the table at the bottom. So the single family table at the bottom, that first segment that's less than or equal to 6,000 square feet in Fate, The average lot size in that segment for bait is 5,645 square feet. And then the 6,000 to 11,000 square foot lots, the average lot size is 7,523. So that's what these lot sizes are representing. The numbers along with them are calculated assuming that these blocks develop with those size lots on them and generate the revenue per acre shown in the table at the bottom. So in the very first block, it's 160,000 square feet, which is true for all the 400 by 400 blocks. If the average lot size is 5,645 square feet, you can fit a little over 28 lots on there, which is about 70 people for single family homes. You get $23,269 per block. The annual cost of those roads is right around $10,000. So your net revenue is $13,260. So when you go down the list to the right, the bigger those lot sizes get, the more your net revenue drops. So the first three blocks still maintain a net positive revenue, finishing with that $1,700 per acre net revenue, or $1,700 net revenue in the middle block. But then as soon as you get to those last two blocks, you get into the red. You get a $3,800 net loss, followed by an $8,300 net loss. So those are the different lot sizes on the same block size. What happens when you go up with the same lot sizes, but a bigger block size? So the idea of an 800 by 800 block isn't super realistic, but it's just for illustrative purposes. So your block size goes from 160,000 to 640,000. But the important metric to look at is that bottom net revenue number. So you have increased your buildable footprints far more than you've increased your infrastructure cost burden. Okay, and it's going to get reflected in the net revenue. So you go from $73,000 net revenue to $58,000 to $26,000 to $4,600, and then back down to $13,000 on the last one. So the revenue numbers are much stronger for the bigger blocks, and it's playing off the relationship between you have less infrastructure compared to more buildable space, which is generating more revenue. So under this idea, the block size, as it goes up, can have a very positive impact on your fiscal sustainability. Go ahead and go to the next slide. So how does that work? So if we take a 400 by 400 square foot or a 400 by 400 block, and you just do it to the left, the example on the left is a straight grid of streets. So there's streets all the way around it, there's streets through the middle, and if you assume a 24-foot right-of-way, you have total 2.73 total lane miles of road infrastructure in here, which is an annual road cost of $90,000. If you're gonna do like the cost estimate of how much you have to pay every year, it's about $90,000 to upkeep these roads. And so your net revenue is about $119,000 if every one of these blocks was built out to that average lot size in the smallest lot size category for single family homes. Okay, and that's just paying for streets. So that's not including all the public safety stuff that would also be really expensive to parks or city administration. Now, in the first example on the left, everything is streets, typical streets like we would think of. In the example on the right, some of those orange lines are replaced with blue dashed lines. And what that's representing is saying, you know what, these blocks are really small, so we want to keep the pedestrian and maybe bicycle connectivity between these blocks. But vehicles move at much faster speeds. They don't need a right-of-way every 400 feet. It's not a big deal for a car to drive another 400 feet in order to make a turn. Now, for a person walking, or someone in a wheelchair, or someone on a bike, like a kid, that extra 400 feet does make a difference. But it really doesn't when you're driving in an air-conditioned car, listening to your favorite podcast. You might actually want to drive another 400 feet. The kicker is that when you replace some of these street segments with, instead of a full curb and gutter street, if you replace it with like a 12-foot pedestrian and bikeway, you're not having a huge negative impact on your connectivity. In fact, you're not impacting the pedestrian and bike connectivity at all. You might be improving it. But the vehicle connectivity isn't changing that much. But your cost of infrastructure is changing. So if you keep the same revenue line, your cost is going to decrease, and you're going to go from 119,000 net revenue to 129,000 net revenue. So your net's going up, your connectivity is staying the same, and your pedestrian and bicycle environment is improving without really diminishing your vehicle experience. Oh, I was hitting my arrows. Brandon, hit the next.
Felix, may I ask you a question about that?
Yeah,
You got a
Felix,
question?
yep.
So on that last one, you've got these pedal and bike paths. Like, what does that look like if your house fronts one of those? How do you get in and get out? I mean, are you biking
Sure.
to work
So,
every day?
Let's go to the next one because I'll visualize it.
Okay, thanks.
So when you do that kind of thing, you've got to have access to the houses, right? You've got to have vehicle access. So in those cases, those would be alley loaded houses. So you would get alleys giving access to the back off the streets that are still connected. So in this case, you have block patterns that are similar, but all the vehicle access. Go ahead and go to the next one, Brennan. But here you go. So you took out, in this example, you took out the two street segments on the far right and the far left in the middle. And so what you have is you still have vehicle access to those houses. They're alley loaded, except now they front onto a green or just a trail space. And that can be, you see these sometimes in development patterns like cottage courts. A lot of the newer small lot subdivisions are taking a design approach like this, where it's alley loaded, but your house faces onto a common green or park space or a really highly developed trail. And it creates a really interesting, really vibrant environment in front of these houses without diminishing the access they have to the streets. And so on that first example, if you can go back to that first one for a minute that had all the streets in it. The net revenue you get after calculating all the infrastructure in here in the houses is about $38,954 net revenue across these 6 blocks. And so that's accounting for, let's see, I've got my notes, 36,000 annual maintenance costs for the alleys and the streets, and 75,000 revenue for all the houses. So that gives you your net about almost $39,000 in net revenue. Okay, so go to the next one. So by replacing some of those full street cross sections with, we assumed, I think it was a 12-foot, 12-foot pedestrian bicycle pathway. So these were 24-foot right-of-ways. So this 12-foot pathway is only going to take up about half that space. So there's still lots of green space between the fronts of these houses. But when you replace them, your net revenue comes up from $38,000 to $44,000. So that's a significant difference. Your revenue is remaining $75,000, but your cost has dropped to $30,000 per year. And it bumps it up from $38,000 to $44,000 net revenue. Go to the next one, Brennan. So if you really take this idea forward and you say, well, we really don't need a really tight connected or as tightly connected network for vehicles. We just want to maintain it for pedestrians and cyclists or folks in wheelchairs. But we also want to maintain some kind of grid, an adequate grid for our vehicles to go around. You can really start to play with your block links and say, you know, maybe we have a block link standard for vehicle access and then a complementary block link standard for pedestrian and bicycle access. And it would be potentially just something up to how developers want to address it. But it could potentially save a whole lot of money for the city and also bump the revenue. So in this case, the blocks have actually got bigger. So you don't have quite as much infrastructure in there. But what you've also done is by making the blocks bigger, you've increased the number of lots you can get per acre because you've removed a lot of the public right-of-way space. And so in this example, you have the same kind of overall footprint, but you actually get 12 additional lots in there. And so you've decreased your costs even more. You've gone from 30,000 annual costs in the last example down to 27,000. And you've also increased your revenue from 75,000 to 83,000. So your net revenue is going from 44,000 in the last example up to $56,000 per year. So those are significant differences. And it would be an approach that, although kind of conceptually foreign to what we think about, we actually see this all over cities. We just don't really recognize it. Go to the next slide, Brennan. So this is what I mean. So this would be considered a super block, right? You have your public right-of-way highlighted in blue. So there's actually a public street going through this apartment complex. But all of the right-of-ways that are in orange are considered drive-by, and they're privately maintained. So you have kind of a succession of vehicle speeds. Your highest vehicle speeds are going to be in the blue, and then your lowest vehicle speeds are going to be in the orange. And then your lowest speeds overall are going to be going on the sidewalks in between all of the housing blocks. So this is an apartment complex, so they have lots of sidewalks and pedestrian access. But these are functionally blocks. All the space in between these drive aisles and streets, those are blocks functionally. They're just not public blocks. They're private blocks. And so this is illustrating close to the same principle where as a city, you're allowing the block sizes to get bigger. And on the private side, they can fill that with whatever kind of connectivity they need. They can fill it with pedestrian connectivity. They can fill it with vehicular connectivity as much as they want to. It's just privately maintained. So it's a huge win for the city, financially speaking, and also for a lot of the people who live here. So they have a level of connectivity that is not often achieved in some single family neighborhoods where we don't think about blocks the same way. Go to the next slide, Brennan. So this happens in commercial developments too. So what you have are the blue lines, again, are public right-of-way. So you go from, I can't remember what interstate that is, but to the far left, those are the interstate travel lanes. The next one over to the right is the frontage lane. And then you have the access lane across the top. So you have a decrease in speed. And then once vehicles start turning into their slowest speed zones, it goes back down to the privately maintained drive aisles. So this principle is actually something we run into all the time, and we do almost without thinking about it with commercial developments and apartment complexes. So the public block is rather large here, but the internal connectivity remains pretty vibrant. And so it's an interesting exercise when you think about cities really being divided into two spaces. There's space where things move, and there's space where things come to rest. And we talked earlier about the highest revenue spaces are the ones where designed for people to come to rest. So it's the internal part of the block designed for people. That's your high revenue makers. And then you've got your spaces where everything is moving. What's interesting about designs like this is a lot of these blocks actually aren't designed for people at all. They're designed for cars. So all these parking stalls are functionally blocks. They're just blocks entirely dedicated to vehicles. And they end up eating into the revenue potential of the site. So you could have a mixed-use development on the site that had a lot less parking and maybe a similar privately maintained block structure, but a lot higher revenue. Okay, go ahead, Brendan. And so you can do something similar in residential neighborhoods. Now, this is a relatively well-connected neighborhood. There's lots of entry, ingress, egress for vehicles throughout. It's got lots of alley-loaded houses. But there's still space in this neighborhood where you could save the city some money by just removing some of the streets and converting them over to pedestrian and bicycle access. Those streets are highlighted in green. Those green spaces could be converted to pedestrian bicycle ways without affecting the vehicular access to the rest of the neighborhood or the houses themselves. So all of the alley ingress, egress points are maintained, but you've removed a significant amount of public infrastructure that would need to be maintained by the city. Go ahead, Brendan. And so you can do something similar downtown. Like we're back to the grid that gets planners excited. But even here, you could remove some of the public infrastructure and cost burden, or at least decrease it, by filling in some of the vehicular access points with more pedestrian and bicycle-oriented thoroughfares. And so those can be designed to allow emergency vehicle access, so your EMS, your fire, your police still have access across the same grid that currently exists, but the vehicles are going to be isolated more, sometimes to their travel time benefit, by converting some of these to pedestrian and cyclist ways. And you're ending up saving a lot of money in the long run for the city. So even downtown grids like this could be improved dramatically from a fiscal standpoint. But like I said, this is an approach we can take with the block length standards. The extent to which we do it is something we'd love to get feedback on. If it's something you want to do, if you want to have block length standards that are based on vehicles and then a complementary standard based on pedestrian, bicycle, and emergency vehicle access, the data is all here to support that and to drive those fiscal sustainability points home. It's just a matter of what the city of Fate wants to see on the ground.
So thanks, Felix. Any discussion on this? I think we have two major policy issues here that we're exploring as we take these concepts and we start translating them into language for the Unified Development Ordinance. And the first thing that Felix's data suggested was something that looks at maybe a maximum as opposed to just a minimum block length. Or lot size, I'm sorry, in our base zoning districts. It's an unusual standard. It's not something most communities, when they set lot size, it's a minimum, because that's the way a lot of communities used to have thought about zoning, and they've thought about zoning as a way of minimizing development impacts. And in the past, that's thought to minimize that. But as Felix has demonstrated by putting a ceiling on them, we have a more predictable range between, or a more predictable division between our districts. We open up smaller lots that open up revenue potential for the city, which is consistent with your comprehensive plan policies, your long-range planning policies, which is why we're having this discussion to begin with. And so it maximizes that, it unleashes a lot of that potential. And then the second one is the block standards, and that's something that's part of our scope of services. We're taking a look at block size. Most cities only think of that in terms of vehicular blocks, but adding pedestrian blocks, I know in other codes that I've written connectivity ratios and connectivity standards and requirements. And on one of the recent ones I did, this was actually from the development community, suggested, what about building in a pedestrian connection and counting that? And we did. And that gets to exactly what Felix is talking about here, because it could allow a developer to incorporate that. It would probably save them some money, not building a full street. It would save the city revenue, and it would maximize its net revenues. And another potential benefit that occurs to me is if we maintain that right of way, if we ever need it for streets, we could improve it that way. Looking to the future, although in practice, I've seen that happen in neighborhoods, sometimes aren't real enthusiastic about having their nice pedestrian block converted into a street block. Nevertheless, if that's something the city wanted to do for emergency access to deal with future vehicular traffic demands, things like that, it could do that. So those two standards, are there any thoughts on that before we go to the rest of the presentation?
I have a quick question. So am I correct that the whole block length, like turning some streets into pedestrian bike lane stuff, that only really works with alley-loaded housing? Because you still have to maintain some ability for people to drive their cars to their houses?
I think I would say that the alley loaded would be one option that you could consider. I mean, you could, depending on the type of road, type of street, whether it's A, B or C type of street, you could still do front loaded garages on some of those and still remove some of them. And the examples that we showed, I think it would be a different development pattern that's not, I don't think, really here right now, that I think would be appropriate to consider as part of this, that could, again, bring that fiscal mindset into it a little bit more.
Okay.
And there's also some great examples. Most of the suburban neighborhoods built around DFW have really long block lengths. And so their vehicular access is actually spread out, just like we're talking about. What they don't have is the pedestrian and bicycle access. And so even if you took some of these really long residential curvilinear blocks that we see and pretty common in development patterns, you could achieve the same principle we're talking about just by bisecting some of those large blocks that are all of houses that are front loaded by a pedestrian access point. So no, it doesn't necessarily require alley loaded houses.
And
I would
some
also-
cottage courts have parking courts, things like that, so that, you know, that opens up that space for the pedestrian access, and then that parking court, of course, is private and doesn't become a public maintenance option. So like Brennan mentioned, it's not the only one, but this was just part of what we were illustrating.
Just to clarify, what we're talking about is a new standard for predominantly for future development. I don't think we're trying to endorse any kind of policy where we would retroactively take out streets. I mean, unless somebody wanted to, but I think the mindset that we have right now is that as we're looking forward as a cost-saving measure, as a measure to encourage non-vehicular access to places, while still accommodating the need for vehicular and emergency access to neighborhoods. This is, I think, a smart way to look at it. But as Mark and everyone said, you know, as our advisory body through this UDO process, we are asking for pretty explicit feedback on these two policy items, because we don't want to start going down one pathway and then when we bring adoption materials, it's contrary to what your expectations are and ultimately contrary to the direction that the city council wants us to go as well. So we are hoping that this data, this incredible data, I mean, I'm so impressed. I know that all the staff are so impressed with the work that this team has put into putting real numbers to these concepts. And I've never seen this before. So hopefully that helps you all understand why we're looking at these rather innovative policy directions. For example, the lot maximum. That's a bit more of an aggressive move, but it ensures that the ideas, the concepts that we all agreed on in the comprehensive plan can be realized because we put those constraints on the development pattern to match what we envisioned when we looked at our fiscal analysis for the comprehensive plan. So I want to put that out there. We're not going to go tear up roads right away, but it's a potential for diversification of access strategies in a new neighborhood.
Justin's in the back looking at the CIP program going, okay, which one?
Yeah, so a couple other things, I mean, because I've seen this done in other cities. I think I was showing houses in Solana or somewhere where you live in your front yard, not your backyard, right? And you do see more people out. It's a little weird at first because you're driving around to get somewhere else. I think the biggest challenge that we have is what we've seen in the past. People do not want and have not wanted rear entry to their homes. And I think that's the biggest challenge in looking at this concept. While I think it's great to live in your front yard, you know, play ball, get to know your neighbors and stuff, you sort of, I mean, you still have a little bit of a backyard, but you're essentially living in almost a zero lot line to do this. So what does this look like for the future, for the families, and how do you get the buy-in from a community to do something like this?
Yeah, and I think that's exactly why I asked about does this only work with alley-loaded
Correct.
housing? Because we have had very negative reaction from the public when people have proposed developments with alley-loaded housing. And like, I am all for having a diversity of housing, and I think we do have some alley-loaded housing coming in. But I would want to make sure that whatever comes out, there are other options besides alley-loaded housing, because if we come up with something that basically limits us to that, that's going to be a problem for anything that complies with the UDO based on public reaction.
It's funny that our town has issues with alley-loaded housing. When you look at our neighbor directly to the west, who 90% of their homes are alley-loaded houses, and they are very anti-front-loaded houses. The issues that I'm having right now are just more conceptual, as far as I'm kind of getting into that grumpy old man stage, and just not having a street in front of my house. Where are my friends going to park when they come over? It's just it's a whole new concept, as far as, okay, not only do we have these bike pedestrian paths in front of our house, but we're going to have to ask visitors to park somewhere else and either tell them to bring their bike, or it's new concepts that I haven't thought about yet.
Well, and I think that's to your point. I mean, your visitors are going to be limited to what's in your driveway, and if you're not using your garage to park your cars, that presents challenges as well. So I think that the maximum in that block design is a tough sell across the board when you are a family that entertains and you want to maintain that kind of lifestyle. I love the concept. I think it's great. But I think we have to plan for, what does it really look like for long haul? When your kids grow up, you got 6 cars now. Where are we parking?
Well, and we're talking about lifestyles, thinking about kids. As I'm working through this in my mind, I'm thinking more of that design pattern probably works far better for what we're talking about between the railroad tracks and the highway, in the area that we're talking about, where there's going to be more density, to where it's easier to, okay, maybe we're not putting the roads in, but 2 blocks down we've got a parking garage or open air parking lot, or something that'll support that development. And again, I'm just kind of talking through my thoughts out loud, but it's definitely not as family oriented as what Fate is accustomed to. It's more of a probably married couple, young married couple, older married couple, just at different lifestyle stages than somebody who's moving into an area with the intent of bringing up their kids in that house.
Yeah, I don't know. I've seen them with 4 bedrooms in these places. So, you just kind of, it's about the lifestyle you want to live, right? So it's an interesting concept to see how we move forward with that and get city buy-in. When I mean city, I mean, our friends and partners that are on the streets with us.
I think it does appeal to different stages of life, because for the first time in my life, I live on a 5,500 square foot lot. And I left acres in Santa Fe County, and I don't ever want to have to take care of acres again. My child is grown. My grandkids have their own big yard. I just never knew how lucrative a little lot. I've always lived in communities where a larger lot was associated with, I assumed it was a greater revenue. And I'm an accountant by degree. I'm a financial thinking person, but these numbers from the last presentation and this one kind of blow my mind. It makes me feel better about my little postage stamp lot, but it could appeal to entry level, people starting out in a house. My son works all the time. His lot in the Shores is not very big either, but I'm curious to know the objection within Fate to alley-loaded homes. That's not existed in any community where I've lived either, but my family in both Rockwall and Roy City live that way, and it makes an attractive neighborhood to not see everybody's car in the street or in the driveway.
Yeah, and I assume that builders will only build alley-loaded lots if some people want to live there. Like, maybe I would never want to live there, but I'm sure they're attracted to some people, and so that's why I think that it's good to have diversity. The objection from people who don't live in alley-loaded housing is that they're dangerous, they're dirty, they're like There's more maintenance because you need to maintain both the alley and the street in front of the house, which I guess wouldn't apply in this scenario. But that's why I think you'll get objections from people even outside of the, like, if a person is never going to live in an alley-loaded lot, they still might object to having an alley-loaded lot built in the community next to them because of concerns about crime, danger, uncleanliness, emergency access. Those are the objections we heard when we've seen those types of proposals.
Felix, did you have a couple comments you wanted to make?
Yeah, I was just going to speak to, I mean, first of all, I've enjoyed the discussion. Those are great. It's good to know the insight from, public input you've gotten in the past. So there's a couple of different approaches maybe to think about is that the block standards really could just be two options. That if a developer wants to build a neighborhood, they can do vehicle blocks within a certain range or pedestrian blocks within a certain range. So it's not requiring necessarily alley access. It's something that's fashionable in some parts of the country to build that way, and it kind of goes in and out of fashion. But it's certainly a doable approach to front-loaded houses. In fact, there's a lot of front-loaded house design neighborhoods that will have some kind of pedestrian cut through. It's typically just one, and it's typically going to like a park that's next to it or a school that's adjacent so kids can walk there without going out to the collector road. So that's just a very small example of the same principle. But the idea would be that if a developer wants to come in and build less infrastructure per block, that they could, that there's an option for it. Or if they just wanted to build a vehicular grid network, they could also do that within the bounds of how the UDO defines what the minimum or maximum block size is for vehicular access. The hope was just to open up the opportunity for a developer to come in and potentially build less streets while maintaining the pedestrian and bicycle access. So I just wanted to encourage everyone that alleys are not required, but it's certainly an option if a developer wanted to do that.
Yes, and that's what, to build on what Felix said, and the approaches we've taken in other codes, the connectivity ratio is something that gives developers that flexibility, because parts of a community, and I've seen larger developments built this way, could have a more meandering street network with cul-de-sacs and that sort of thing, and other parts of the community are more tightly connected. But it all balances out, and now we can add the pedestrian paths to that, count that as part of the mix, and really create some flexibility. And I really appreciated the comment about this appealing to different stages of life. As somebody who's an empty nester who's building a brand new house on a street, on an alley, I can tell you those alleys are clean, they're safe, no crime in that area has emerged, especially because of them. In fact, over Christmas, they have what they call Christmas Alley. Everybody dresses them up with their Christmas lights, and they set the AM radio to it, and it's a big thing. It attracts people from all over the region. So, and granted, that's not for everyone. And I also know people in my former neighborhood who went the other direction and moved out to rural areas, and that's fine. This will create those options. We can also adjust that by district, and we're reshuffling the districts. How this plays out will vary by district as well, because those are different character areas in the city of Fate. What this looks like in and around your downtown is going to be quite different than what it looks like further from downtown, where you're not going to see as much of the tight gridded network. And the focus is more on, and the emphasis is more on privacy, as opposed to, the comment about living in your front yard and seeing your neighbors. Some people don't. Some people want a lot of that. Some people want less of that. And this creates an opportunity, to build some of that flexibility in. But we've also shown what that means fiscally. Further out, as you get further away from that grid, And the options that Felix presented, it becomes more of a fiscal burden on the city ultimately. And the plan talks about minimizing that fiscal burden and maximizing our revenue potential. That's something we would build into the fiscal model that's going to become part of the procedures in the Unified Development Ordinance, and something that we're creating more of a framework for developers to plan around and for the city to plan around. So it just understands the fiscal impact of those choices. It's not that those choices are bad, they just all come with a price tag. And that's the beauty of the policies that you've adopted.
Aaron, did you have a comment?
Yeah, I had a couple thoughts. So when it comes to alley-loaded housing, I think people put a lot of reasons, but I think sort of a natural human tendency is it feels like a lot of pavement. That's what it feels like to me when I go through those. I've got pavement in front, pavement in back, and I want a little more green space. I think if you do something like this where you have converted that street into green space, I think a lot of the complaints about alleys may not be as strong, just because it feels like your house is in a park and that's your way out is your alley, right? So I think that's a good solution. I also think that's important if we start enforcing maximum lot sizes. Then you're, again, feel closed in. But if you do this sort of where they talk about where you're making bike paths in green space, then those maximum lot sizes don't feel so restrictive. Like I said, it feels like you live in a park. I've seen a couple neighborhoods where it works really well. I do think the parking is a bit of an issue, though, because you have your 2 spots in your driveway and that's it. I've seen spots where they'll make a little, 5-spot parking lot because not everybody's going to have a party the same day. And so you put a couple of those in the neighborhood and generally, maybe someone has to walk a few hundred feet to get to your house. Well, hopefully it'll be okay.
Yeah, I mean, that's definitely something that we can certainly consider, as part of, if we're going to go to smaller lots or codify some of these things, maybe codifying in, creating some social spaces depending on your lot size and everything else, or codifying some areas that if we do alley loaded, type of development that you need to have maybe some, reserved parking areas and everything else to support that. Again, trying to be as fiscally minded as possible to get the better, the most fiscal, predictability back out of it. But I think those are definitely some things that could be considered as part of that as well.
If I could just add, a lot of the conversation naturally has revolved around single-family neighborhoods, but as was kind of alluded to, like the I-30 focus area, like the downtown, this could potentially be even more successfully implemented in a mixed or non-residential area.
Right, and I
We're
think
just talking about access. It doesn't, we're not talking about access to a specific use. It's just about the grid pattern or the connectivity. And so I could definitely see peripheral areas to the downtown as we're planning out the U-track with the applicant or with the property owner there. This may be an interesting and innovative way to maintain that access.
And I think that's probably the best area where it's best served. It's obviously retrofitting Wood Creek or Williamsburg would be pretty painful. But definitely inside the railroad tracks, the 30 corridor, it makes sense. The other question you asked, I don't think we really touched on until Aaron just mentioned, is maximum lot sizes. And just my personal opinion, and everybody speak up as you see fit, but as it relates to, again, these tighter, more dense areas that we've built out in the comp plan, in my mind, it makes a lot of sense to have maximum lot sizes. That being said, I wouldn't want any maximum lot size to have any adverse impact on any existing lots in the downtown corridor that may be redeveloped. But definitely in undeveloped land, it would, based on what was done in the comp plan, all financial analysis, having a maximum lot size makes a lot of sense because we're not talking about typical suburban development in those corridors. We're talking about a more urban feel.
Well, and I also think that as we're looking at things and trying to make a connection between the north and the south side of the city, right, being on 30, if you're trying to do walking paths and you're trying to do bike paths, but you're using the same section as cars do, we do have to separate that, and we do have to figure out the right way to do that so that there's a safety issue that's kind of mitigated immediately, right? You're not trying to ride your bike as a 10-year-old in a group of their friends like we used to probably all do when we were young to the Pizza Hut or the Pizza Inn, right? During the summers. We don't have that ability in our city to do that. So I do like trying to figure that out.
So just so I understand, you're more favorable to the denser zoning districts to have that lot size maximum, but perhaps once you're getting out to the typical like suburban densities, maybe the R1, R2, and then of course the residential state, the very large lots, you don't think the maximum lot size is quite as important? Is that
That's my thought.
that's your thought? Okay.
I think it might be interesting to attract, in pockets, developers that are interested in a maximum lot size that hits that high net revenue number. Not all over the city, not the equivalent of a Wood Creek, certainly, but my little neighborhood is probably similar to that. It's small lots, and it attracts a certain buyer, and I would be in favor of maximum lot sizes for little pocket areas, and then you're going to get that develop. I mean, I would think it's higher revenue for the developer as well, not just the city of Fate. But those numbers really impressed me, that net revenue. I would have never realized it was that profound until I saw it laid out.
Yeah, I mean, obviously, I don't think we would we would recommend that the entire city become this so dense that it's not an attractive community. And I think, as Felix had mentioned early on in the process, is like how much of your portfolio potentially do you want to have in maybe that more walkable, a little bit more dense, type of neighborhood, type of environment. And again, some of the concepts that we presented don't have to go across, as Ryan said, to every single district. It could just be more concentrated, as you're mentioned, to some specific districts that makes the most sense. But I think at the same time, you do want to protect yourself at the end of the day. I mean, you do have land, that is on the outskirts. Again, we did do your comprehensive plan. We're definitely trying to focus on mixed-use development and controlling where growth is as much as possible. But on some of these, the outlying land and everything else, I think you want to be able to protect yourself a little bit too on some of those areas. So just something to think about and consider as well.
And Ryan, talking about, I'm sorry, I'm coming back to the comment you made as far as maximum lot size only in the more dense areas. As I understand the comp plan, is everything that I've seen as it relates to our typical standard suburban development, our 5,000 square foot to 10,000 square foot lots, all the space that we've allocated for that comp plan is allocated for.
Not 100%, but pretty darn close, yes.
Right. So I just don't think of that, at least in this phase of where we're at, as being as big of an issue or consideration, as much as focusing on where we're going to get the greatest financial benefit. Now, as it relates to the comp plan that we're going to redo, and when we update it in 4 or 5 years, when 552 gets developed out to a four-lane road or 5-lane road or whatever it's being built out to per road bond, it may be a completely different conversation. We may have developers begging to put 40, 50-foot lots out there, and I think that's where the test for the comp plan is going to come in. But at least in my mind right now, most of these conversations is really it's maximum lot size, focus on the profitability. That stuff's all along I-30 corridor and up through basically from the 551 corridor from Fresh all the way up to downtown. If I'm thinking about that wrong, please let me know. But
I'd say you're pretty accurate on that. We do want to keep in mind, preparation, understanding of how that next increment of expansion of our city may look based on these standards. And I do want to point out, and Felix mentioned it briefly in one of the slides, where I showed those vertical lines of all the dots kind of concentrated. those are concentrated at the minimum lot size for that zone. What that indicates is that there's a pressure to go further, to go smaller if allowed, but they're constrained by our minimum lot sizes in the zoning district. I mean, some of it might be developer driven, but as you mentioned, it is a profit motive for them to have smaller lots with, houses as long as they meet the lot coverage requirements, right? So the message that tells me is that there's a market drive for somewhat smaller lots at least in those areas. So that's why I think, a smaller lot minimum, even in some of our typical suburban districts, might be something to look at. And then in the appropriate zones, a lot maximum, you really constrain what you're going to get out of it financially.
So one thing I would like to just keep in consideration if we're doing maximum lot sizes or something like that is sort of make sure there's still room for public space, common areas, because if you just pack everything in and it's just buildings everywhere, it's not going to be, for a downtown mixed use area, that makes sense, but if we're talking about residential in particular, if you're going to cram them in there, you've got to have some public spaces.
No, I mean, again, going back to my point before, I think you definitely would want to codify some social spaces into here to ensure, if again, we go maximum development, or again, we can work through that process to ensure that you'd get some, pocket neighborhoods and everything else, so you have that walkability, because again, if we're going to go to, the block and length standards, and I think it's sounding that there's support from that as well, that that you'd like to divide those two different standards up, and what that looks like, we can certainly work through and everything else. But having, again, those more walkable blocks, want to walk them to a park or, to a space and everything else that they can actually enjoy. That's part of that. So.
Yeah, I'd like to add a couple comments that Ryan said. There was a great observation about the vertical lines and that pressure from developers. I was just working on a code in another DFW city where the developers were actually telling us like their lot size minimums were making some of their projects not pencil out. I think they were running into like a 7,000 square foot lot size minimum. We had a developer tell us, like, if you would just let us go to 6,000 square feet, we could do this project, but we can't get there. We need the extra lots. And so it wasn't a big change. It was 7,000 to 6,000, which is, most people who live on a lot that size aren't going to notice the differences too much. And they were building the same house. The 7,000 square foot lots were required, but the same house they were building on those, they would have built on the 6,000 square foot lots, and they would have built more of them. And it wouldn't have been that dramatic of a change. But the only barrier was just the minimum lot size from the city for that zoning district. The other great thing to think about, like what Brennan was talking about with the pocket parks and programming in, if you do have the smaller lot sizes, they do need more social spaces, which is really important. What it also does is it makes the city's investment into those social spaces, it creates more ROI socially back to them. So I've worked with cities before that have great park systems, but they also have subdivisions with very large minimum lot sizes. And so everybody's got their own private park in their backyard, and nobody goes to the public parks. And so it's a little bit of redundancy and somewhat of a waste of money on the city's part, that if everybody's got their own private parks, it doesn't make as much sense to invest a lot of money in a public park system, because they're so spread apart and underutilized that it would have been money better spent elsewhere. So that's something else to keep in mind.
Well, and I think too that when we're talking about walking and biking and driving past, we're in a position at the moment where it's really hard to get in and out of Fate on a daily basis anyway. And as we talk about the future, making it more walkable and friendly, the reality is more cars are coming. So we have to make sure that, it doesn't take 20 minutes to get through the light on 551 just to try and turn right or left to get where you're going. It doesn't matter what time of the day practically at this moment, right? So the future has to have an infrastructure that supports everything that we're trying to do from what we've seen so far in this presentation.
Mark, I think you're up quick on.
Yeah, so just to summarize,
Okay.
I think we have got some really good feedback. I appreciate the robust discussion. I feel pretty good about kind of what direction we're gonna end up going, and so now our project team will get a little bit more granular on these specific policy directions and start translating that into code. And so, again, I appreciate you spending some time on these. These are big decisions here because it is a shift away from what suburban communities traditionally do. And clearly, Fate's trying to do something a little different, not just to be different, but because it makes sense for the future of the community. So thanks again for that. And I'll hand it back over to Brennan and Mark now.
Cool. We'll try to go through this quick, so we know we kept you guys here a long time. So, Mark.
Okay, great. And Brian just mentioned, yeah, we're going to get a little bit more granular from what Felix talked about, just in terms of some of the specifics of the rest of the development code. So I'm going to talk a little bit about home-based businesses. These are all things that were in our scope of services. What I'm calling residential diversity, I'll talk about that in a second, how your permitting process works, and then sign regulations. So next slide, please. Those things are all, just sort of enhance what you just heard from Felix. So you have some home occupation regulations right now. You limit the number of people, from outside of the household who work at the home. You limit the floor area that the home occupation can cover. Those are some traditional regulations. Home occupations, an example, or what I'm doing right now. I'm in my home office, where I'm in front of my computer at a public hearing. Usually I'm in front of my computer writing a zoning ordinance. But some home occupations are places where people they may have kids over, and teach. They have childcare at home. They have other kinds of activities that just occur within the four corners and within that building envelope that comprises their home. And you have a one-size-fits-all set of regulations right now. I've seen other communities that expand on what's allowed if you're in a rural location, for example. If you're on a 40-acre lot, we wouldn't want people repairing cars on that bottom image on a smaller lot, but maybe on a 40-acre lot, if it's at a detached unit in the back, it's what farmers have done traditionally. My grandpa used to repair his tractor in his barn, and it didn't bother anybody. So, that's something to look at just with home occupations. And as you grow, there's going to be less of that. Your agricultural lands, over time, it'll get rezoned to something else, and there's less of an opportunity for that. But some of the communities I've worked in address things like low impact or no impact home occupations. Again, like what I'm doing, my neighbors have no idea what I'm doing inside my house right now, versus places where maybe you're selling something, you get a couple of trips in and out a day, and it becomes somewhat noticeable. We just don't want to change the character of that to something that becomes bothersome to people who've invested in a residential neighborhood. And as our districts get more intense, you have the middle option in some of your special districts now, and this is something where we want to revisit the standards, make sure they work for those commercial areas. Where you have a live-work unit, it's something that was built originally to accommodate both a working environment and a living environment, where you have maybe on the ground floor, maybe a studio up front or something. You've got a business, and on the upper floors or maybe in the back is where people live. And then the third one is something that IDA presented examples of, where a handful of communities around the country are starting to look at, and you've probably seen this, I'm sure Dallas has them as well. The example IDA showed was from Minneapolis, which is credited with having regulations for this, although they still call them home occupations, I believe. But you see this in some cities where just out front, you basically got a storefront. But up above, it's something that used to be a dwelling unit. I've seen this in cities in the Northeast a lot. they're basically sometimes non-conforming uses. It's something that was a hair salon at the ground level or something else, and up above was a traditional house, often on a corner lot. So that could become a flower shop, it could become something else. This is obviously probably not something we want in all of our residential districts, but again, in or around downtown and more intense districts, maybe it's something we allow so somebody could put a corner store there. And we open the door for local entrepreneurship, local investment, local businesses popping up that have a corner store that people can walk to, things like that. Obviously, this is something we need to consider carefully going forward. I know there would be concerns about traffic, about businesses that stay open too late, businesses that have a lot more people coming in and out, maybe than you have in a traditional home occupation. But there are some parts of the community where this might work, especially in the more intense residential districts, perhaps. So that's something we're exploring right now. And the biggest change would be what you see on the right. You already have regulations for the next two, but something that also, maybe expands the floor area that's allowed for a home occupation inside the unit that doesn't change its physical character, and is maybe a little less intrusive on investment in those types of uses. Any comments on that before I go to the next slide?
What was that?
I'm sorry, I didn't catch that.
Can you go ahead and speak into the microphone?
Yeah, we currently have the live work units in the downtown Fate, which is a great model. The accessory, I was just trying to think, we really don't have that, built-in, 1800, homes, out here that, lend to that, that model. Yeah, just anything we really have downtown, I hate to say it, we're going to, remove it.
Not much is of a condition that can persist and be kind of transformed like this.
When I see some of the older homes as you go from I-30 to downtown, I've lived in a city where homes like that were converted to businesses, and sometimes most typically like a law office or doctor's office, and often the physician or the attorney lived and worked in that home. But there were sections of Fort Lauderdale where it was all older homes that became, got zoned to also allow for commercial. And when I drive that down Memorial, those homes look like they would be a good fit for something like that, to me.
Oh, so you said they could fit? Is that what you're saying?
Well, here, the newcomer to town thinks they'd be a good fit. I don't live in one of those beautiful homes that were, built probably in the 50s, I'm going to guess. I don't know, 50s, 60s. But it would lend itself to that because they're facing now a busy highway, not where you'd really want to raise your kid riding their bike, but where it would be easy access for patients or clients to come. Just a thought. I have it every time I drive here.
I'll say that the live work zoning and concept is a tough sell in Texas. I've experienced that on commercial property in Rowlett, where they took half of the neighborhoods surrounding downtown Rowlett and rezoned them for live work units. It fell on its face. And they ended up rezoning it to back to what it was, basically. This is older neighborhoods built in the 30s and 40s. Some of them in the 20s. Just didn't work. So you have to be very careful with that concept because it has not proved, and this was probably 2005 when this happened. They gave it about 10 years and finally zoned it back because the people just weren't interested in there. They thought people would flock to that area. Just didn't happen. Now that neighborhood is slowly rebuilding because frankly some of the older homes are being torn down and they're building duplexes and a few other things. I can see that happening in Fate, but the live-work concept is a tough sell in Texas. And that's been my opinion, and based on property that we still own and was zoned basically without telling all the property owners exactly what was going on. So that's my 2 cents on the live work concept.
Yeah, I mean, I don't think that, the city would be looking at doing a proactive rezone where you just be putting this blanket on. I think it's opening up the opportunity to provide that if you don't have it now, but at least putting some standards on it as well. So it may only be permitted in some districts or some, potential residential areas, but allowing that opportunity and having some standards that go with it is really what I think we're looking at for this one. Am I correct on that, Mark?
That's correct. And the nice thing about some of these units, obviously not the one on the top right, but more the image on the bottom right and maybe the bottom middle, is that some of these units are configured in such a way that if the market drops out for the work part of the unit, it just becomes a residence again. I think the other comment was this at least the conversions, which are something different, because when we've written a lot of what we call RO, residential office districts, to accommodate, I think, what was described, where you have a busy corridor and somebody hangs a shingle out front, it becomes a law office, it becomes a doctor's office, but the residential structure is maintained. That could become this, but those units, if they stay intact, could always go back if the market changes. I mean, nobody knows what the market's going to be 10, 20, 30 years from now. And if it goes a direction we didn't anticipate, the unit stays the way it is, then it could get reconfigured. And you said it best, Brennan. I mean, this is an option that we're exploring. We just want to make sure that we've got metrics in here that protect the neighborhood interests as well. We're looking for ways, based on plan policies, based on the IDA study that was done and presented to you, to open doors for investment opportunities like this. We also are mindful of the impacts it can have on neighborhoods as well. That's what we're striving for in drafting these regulations. Any other comments on this one?
Yeah, next one.
All right. Okay, the next thing that's part of our scope is what was called residential anti-monotony regulations. You have a corner of your Unified Development Ordinance now called residential building design. That's section 35-5.6, where you address things like orientation, you address facade design, that sort of thing. You have a few other, roof design, where your entries go. What you don't have in your baseline regulations, and at least one of your recent PUDs did incorporate something like this, which is something that prevents the lather, rinse, repeat type of thing, where even if the houses are nice on a block, if all the houses look exactly the same, it can become monotonous. And a lot of communities now are looking at ways to encourage or require developers to have, at least X percent of a block to have different elevations, or you require a developer to give you, 4 or 5 elevations for a new development based on its size, that sort of thing, just so you have some sort of a diverse pattern when you're walking down the street. What a lot of communities call this is residential anti-monotony. Personally, I'd rather call it what we want as opposed to what we don't want. The word I settled on just because I ran out of time, was diversity. Maybe there's a better word for that. And the reason why is what we want is something more like what's on the bottom. Obviously, the elevations might not look like that. This is a community near Denver where you have a mix of the front gable traditional design, it's the building in the middle, and the two buildings on the side are modernist. All those elevations are quite different. You walk down that street, it's an interesting walk. I mean, you're looking at a different front porch, you're looking at a different entryway. Every 20 or 30 steps, it makes that walk more interesting, makes it more visually appealing, and et cetera. So that's what we're looking at exploring, adding to those design regulations. Like we said, it's something that has been part of some of your PUD approvals in the past, but we want to make sure that new subdivisions that come in don't give you a barracks-like feel. They have something that's got more of that aesthetic, the more diverse aesthetic on each block. So, any comments on that concept?
I'll just make a note that right now the field is open, for developers to do what they want to do within the confines of our existing development standards. But as an example of what can occur without any kind of residential diversity standards, Phase 3A of the Williamsburg Plan Development has 145 units in it. Every single one of those houses has the exact same floor plan. There might be a little flip here and there. There might be a little tweak in the facade, but they all have the exact same floor plan. And, that's the kind of thing we want to avoid. We want some character in these neighborhoods. We want, you don't have to build wildly different houses like you have in that bottom image, but we want our community to have character, and the way to do that is to break up the monotony of a streetscape with diverse character.
I know we've controlled that a lot through PDs and stuff before. I know it's in the Avondale PD, it's in the Williamsburg East PD. I wasn't aware of the Phase 3. We definitely, if we don't have the standards, need to have them, in my mind, again.
Well, and the issue too is the builder typically is not supposed to repeat. They can repeat the same floor plan, but the exterior has to be different, the brick has to be different, and I think we have to have a little more say-so and stuff like that.
Yeah, I don't think we're proposing doing something incredibly onerous, but just having some teeth to it to some degree, so that we can say, hey, builder. Yeah, and you're right. It is the builder. It's not,
It's not us. It's the builder.
We want to be able to and still come to the table with the builder and say, hey, how can we make this an interesting community, something that is attractive to the buyer, attractive to the future residents. So that's really all we want to accomplish here. We don't want to be incredibly prescriptive, but right now we just have nothing. So we want to have something introduced to the code.
And we just finished a project in the community where the same situations. Actually, they had a strategic plan, and the city council says, what's quality residential development? And as we went through the process and work sessions and everything else, we identified not only just from the residential diversity, we started looking at requiring some bulk standards potentially, looking at diversified setbacks in some of the neighborhoods, some of the things that we talked about tonight. If we start incorporating, residential pass-throughs or paths that are starting to break up, so you don't have 20 homes in a row and everything else, and start looking at the public realm as well as some other standards, that's going to start providing that more character that you're looking for to help diversify some of the neighborhoods as well in the future.
Will that, if we adopt this updated UDO and by the end of the year, will that help the future of Williamsburg? Will that retro into?
It wouldn't be retroactive. A lot of the stuff that we're trying to do with this UDO update, the ship has sailed for much of our existing inventory and even inventory to be built, because the developments are vested when the preliminary plat essentially comes through. So a lot of our existing and soon-to-be built neighborhoods, they have the standards that are in place now. Again, a lot of these are for not only what is immediately buildable, but what the next iteration of our comp plan might look like and things like that. So we're not going to be able to go back and say, hey, Williamsburg, you got to fix this now. It's really about the next developer that we talk with and starts moving ahead on something.
Yes.
Wrong answer, but
That applies to everything in our UDO update. You know, it's forward-looking. It doesn't require somebody to go back and change what they've already done or gotten approved.
Cut him off.
So, any other questions on that? Good. Okay, we'll move on to the next thing, which is permitting. Again, this is an entire part of your UDC, an entire article, or most of it, of Article 2, which set out your procedures in administration and talks about how different, how your processes work at different stages of development. What we're looking at is adding to that a more predictable workflow and a more readable workflow for all of these. You do have, I mean, what the city has now is fairly up to date. I mean, you do have, for example, you got flow charts, which is something most modern codes have. You know, older codes were just a lot of words packed together. You did break that up. You showed flow charts. We'd like to improve on those, but also to have a process that shows you from beginning to end in the same way for each of the processes, where when you turn to, for example, the rezoning section, it'll show you what this process applies to, how you get it started, how you certify whether the application is complete, how you do notice, how you make a decision, what standards apply, whether there's a limit on subsequent applications if it gets denied or the applicant withdraws, how they appeal a decision if that's available, what you just got approved if you get through that process. Does that just take you to the next stage of the process? Does that take you to building permit or certificate of occupancy? And then how you keep track of it. That same format would apply to each of these permitting processes, and we'd have if-then pathways. Like if you do, if you do X, then this means you go to Planning Commission. And if you do Y, maybe it's an administrative approval, and et cetera. So that's how we're looking at making Article 2 easier to understand and navigate for applicants and for folks like y'all who need to know what your decision-making options are when you're faced with any application. So, any questions on that before we move on?
I'll just point out that, a lot of this is already in our code. This is really just revisiting it with some fresh eyes, simplifying things as we can, as Mark mentioned, just doing good about record, displaying it easily, having some kind of if-then type of transitions in the flow chart so that people know what happens if this happens versus if that happens. And also, one thing we're looking at is, certainty of on an applicant's perspective is important because they know kind of what to expect a little bit more. And there are a lot of things that are discretionary at this point. And to the degree that we can, to the degree that you and the City Council want, we do want to make sure that we are maximizing the level of certainty through ministerial or administrative level type of reviews versus the highly discretionary reviews where you have no idea if something's going to be approved, or it might be approved with wildly different conditions. So we're going to take a look at each one of these processes and see if there's a way to kind of pare down and increase the certainty through a simplification of that process.
So the flow chart, is this going to be something that's going to be for internal for the city that they will utilize?
It'll be in the UDO document. It'll be seen by the people reviewing the document too, the applicant.
So, an ask is, as they do the flow chart, do they look at possibly using a swim lane versus a flow chart?
Like a Gantt chart type of thing?
Not so much as a Gantt, but on the swim lane, we'll note as it would move, as it flows, that if it goes to the department or back into department, or if it goes to legal, or, and each lane indicates like what the department's, but the flow moves through, so you see it moving through the department.
Can you send me a version of a swim lane so I can kind of visualize it, and we'll talk about it at the?
Absolutely.
All right, thank you very much.
Okay. Yeah, I have several flow charting software programs that I've used. And if I recall correctly, the swim line, and I think the question sort of got to that, is usually something you apply to internal, who files the documents where. Those are the kinds of things that you care more about behind the permit counter than you do in the UDC or the Unified Development Ordinance. So, it would be unusual. I haven't seen a code that actually has the swim line in the procedures in the code, but that's something we can take a look at.
And I would agree, a flow chart would be the norm, but anybody, I'd say, that would be new to the board or looking at it would give them an idea of how it needs to move through the city.
It makes me think of, and this might be, outside of the scope of the work here, but if we revise our flow charts and get them to a polished condition, if there was a way to translate those and expand upon them, and this would be an effort that staff does, into those swim lanes so that there's a continuity, say, I'm not going anywhere, but say I go somewhere else, the next person that comes in, there's a really clear explanation of the process, because having been here for a year, it's taken me about this year to really internalize those processes, and I still have some kind of confusion sometimes, right? So maybe just documenting our own internal processes outside of the scope of the UDO, but just being a little bit more clear and then being able to share that with appointed officials or city council and whatnot. Very
well,
good.
but if we have this visible to, on the website, so I think it's important for everybody to kind of see what goes on behind the scenes with this kind of stuff, because when you provide notice, what type of notice, how does that work, what's going on behind the scene, they're more informed. It's not a black box. Yep. Thank you.
Okay.
Good.
All right. Thank you. And the next one, this is my favorite topic. Signs. There was a big U.S. Supreme Court case in 2015. And some of you have been if you've been on the Planning Commission for a while, you probably heard about it the last time the city went around the horn revising its sign regulations. But basically, the law, kind of in a nutshell, is you want to avoid regulations that are triggered by what a sign says. You want to focus your regulations on the physical characteristics of the signs. So that case is called Reed versus Town of Gilbert back in 2015. And this is all from the court decision. These are all things you can regulate, and they're not considered content-based. When you regulate by what the sign says, it's called content-based. So, if you call those signs below like directional signs, well, that relates to what the sign says, not the physical characteristics of the signs. If you called them a panel sign or something like that, that's the physical characteristic. But that doesn't mean we can't regulate the physical design of signs. We can regulate size, what the signs are composed of, usually whether they're lighted or not, internally or externally or digitally. That's always a big discussion in any community where I work on signs, whether we allow portable signs and how they work, whether we allow signs on public property or not, where they're located, how big, tall, et cetera. We have a lot of discretion on that, and we can calibrate those, most importantly, and the concurring decision to recognize this, we can calibrate those to our districts, because those districts reflect the character of development as we've described it in the comprehensive plan, and signs are a feature of site and building design. So we want to make sure that they work for us. And so what we're looking at here, you go to the next slide, Brent. Brennan, please. We're looking at allocating signs to districts. Right now, the way your sign regulations are set up is you have one set of regulations for your pylon signs, one for your ground or monument signs, one for your wall signs, and et cetera. And they look like they're one size fits all if you read the ordinance. They do vary by district, but we want to be more explicit about it. And like with your procedures, we want to make sure that we set up like similar characteristics in each of the districts for each of the sign types. So for freestanding signs, that each district regulation would say the number that are permitted, the number per site, the area, height, setback, and then design characteristics, whether we allow them to be digital, well, whether we allow illumination internally, externally, or halo lit. That's a buzzword we use in my town for signs where each individual letter sort of has a halo light around it. So you just see the letters against a black board often. It's kind of an attractive feature. You can see that the sign's more visible. So that's something we allow in some contexts, and then changeable copies. So we're going to allocate those to the district. So we're also going to pay special attention to your downtown, a big feature, one of our big policy pushes in FATE, because downtown signs are often different, and they're different because they respond to the pedestrians. They can still clutter the landscape downtown. They can still obscure things like your like the architectural features of a building. We don't want signs covering up your architecture or covering up too much of a window, and then that benefit you got from having ground level glazing, which makes a street attractive and walkable, is lost because it's covered by a sign, for example. So this is my downtown where I live. That the window that says for sale is where my office used to be, and it's a historic downtown. And most downtown regulations allow things like the what's called the sandwich board, that movable sign that you see that says Rusty Spur. It's got the picture of the lady with the wine glasses. We can allow some more creative types of signs, like you see with the Rusty Spur on the corner. We can allocate different sign area for windows, accommodate banners differently, all kinds of things, but they typically look different downtown. A couple of policy issues that often come up is, do we want to allow neon or not? When I was in law school at Chapel Hill, that was a big discussion they had. They didn't allow neon anywhere downtown. There was a lot of people who felt like, well, it's historic. You don't see as much of it anymore. It's kind of expensive to make, but you still see it. And like a lot of things, like vinyl records, in some areas, it's sort of making a comeback. Some people think it's too loud. Some people think it's part of the character you see in downtowns, and that's kind of what we're posing to you all, what you would think about allowing that. And are you against it? Are you fine with it, or you fine with it, but let's be careful how we allow it. Just like, with accessory commercial units, let's be careful where we allow signs that are lighted internally, especially. Do we want to allow digital signs anywhere? Like a lot of downtowns have that or they allow them to a certain extent because they're not as much of a traffic safety hazard as they are when traffic's moving quickly and you have messages that change every 8 seconds and drivers are distracted. So the sign package downtown will look somewhat different. And we're working on that right now, but those are a couple of things that that we wanted to present to y'all to see what your thoughts are. So any comments or questions about the sign regulations and what you'd like to see in downtown or in mixed-use parts of the city for sign regulations, or even other areas? Any issues that have been bothersome to you with signs and fate? Any thoughts?
I think the signs that recently went up to Bozeman, Big Sky area, they're downtown around Christmas. We didn't decorate at all, really. It didn't feel Christmassy going downtown. Some of the things that they did with the street post here with the light, with, great decorations spanning across the streets and stuff, really made it feel homey, even if you weren't there. So I like this type of thing from a holiday perspective to see down there.
Okay. Any other thoughts or suggestions about what you'd like to see in
I
the sign
guess as I look
regulations?
at it, I wonder what the fine line between getting the appropriate messaging out versus overkill on signs. Because I'm just looking at this one picture that's on the screen right now, and the signage on the side of the building looks great, but then you've got the same business has the drop-down panel sign up above the window with the tent sign out front, and at what point does it become overkill? I don't know what that balance is, but that almost starts looking oversigned to me.
Yeah, I mean, that's generally what we accomplish with, percentage of facade,
Right.
number of signs, things of that nature. Yeah.
I think some of these signs are probably just temporary permitted signs. In this example here, anything that's not, permanent, require permits and only allowed for a week or two at a time, typically is what you're seeing on some of this. Otherwise, I don't have a big problem with what they're doing on this example.
Right. Are y'all talking about the banner that's up top?
Yes,
Okay.
that's one of them.
Yes, I figured it, and I figured that might get some comments too, because that also covers part of the architecture of the building. And, some people don't want to see something like that. And I think what I'm hearing too is that's fine, maybe for a few weeks, but we don't want that to get out. We don't want it out of control. We don't want to see that all the time. Is that accurate?
In my mind, yes. The other piece is if you've got the business next door doing the same exact thing, then it gets a little crazy looking, in my mind.
I see the wine glass one is it just comes out on Tuesdays or whatever night is wine night, and then it goes back in. That doesn't bother me a bit. But I think the banner definitely, you see what the business is on the window, and that's a gorgeous building. I wouldn't want to see a bunch of banners hanging off of some of our beautiful downtown buildings. But I don't mind a temporary, you wheel it out, you wheel it back in, and it doesn't remain.
Yeah, I would say we've done it before, like some of those sandwich boards. Hopefully in a downtown area you have a wide enough like pedestrian zone versus like a furniture type of zone. Like you can see here in the picture that Mark did a wonderful job taking. Like you can see where the brick is on the left hand side, where the light pole is, and in the trees and everything else. That could be identified as more of your furniture zone. That's where the signage could be placed. Whereas like the sidewalk, which is like the gray concrete, is more of the pedestrian zone. So those are some things that could be looked at as well. Mark, I'm just curious because coming from the public sector, I don't want to open up a can of worms here, but the lettering, the rusty spur, on windows and opacity, what has been your, and another code you've worked on, the coverage of windows, have you gone into that a lot or no?
It's usually not that detailed. It's usually a percent. Most communities are anywhere from 10 to 25%. Most communities don't allow you to cover your entire window. Because what we've seen a lot, cell phone stores are one of your frequent examples. Well, they'll take a wrap and cover the entire window, and I know a lot of people think it just looks tacky. I'm one of those people.
Don't forget the blinky lights are on the edge
people who
too.
own the cell store maybe might think differently about it. So you get to, but yeah, you don't want. We want a percent for the window, otherwise it's not opaque anymore. And then if you have a wrap or something like that, yeah, you can't see in the building anymore. And it destroys that. It destroys the opacity, which, and there's actually been studies that have, that have been done about what makes a street walkable. And opacity is one of the, if not the most important criteria and standard that, that we maintain that. And so if you have a window, we can require maybe that, it's just a limit and it's not a wrap either, that it allows you to see in. So anyway, yeah, that's what most of those require. And some communities even get into what, I've seen businesses that'll put a video screen like 5 feet, 3 feet behind the window and project it. I mean, you can get pretty detailed. Some people feel strongly we got to keep that from happening because it's just people getting around our limit. Others think it's just too much. That's just a bridge too far in terms of regulation. And I just want to know what my client wants to do. It's up to y'all if you want to go that far or not. And then I like the comment too about how, I think some planners, their default is to be as restrictive as possible on signs. And I like the comment about, the holiday, what happens over the holidays. Signs add life to a building. I mean, imagine if this building had no signs on it. It wouldn't have the character it does. It shows I think the signs show the building's used and it's lived in, and people love it. And somebody cared to open a business there. And, we want the signs, but we don't want clutter either. And that's a balance. We don't want the regulations clutter, and we don't want the signs cluttering things. So it's balance that we're shooting for here. But we also want to make sure that they reinforce the character of your downtown, because that's the heart of your city. And we want to make sure that it stays that way, and it's a place that people love to visit. So, any other thoughts or suggestions for us as we draft the sign regs?
I've got one quick question. We don't have to go down the rabbit hole on this one, but this is something that I've experienced in other cities. Again, focused on the downtown. Right now we have Pizza Factory that came in, and they have it's a franchise. They have their franchise sign. It's a backlit vinyl, box sign. Whether or not we have more kind of corporate type of users in the downtown, I have seen some cities say, hey, we don't want the typical corporate signage. Keep your logo, but maybe modify it to recognize the kind of climate and the environment. Or are we okay with having, like, say, Pizza Hut for some if they have a storefront, if they put that kind of bright Pizza Hut logo on a box sign, is that okay? Or do we want, to limit the ability of doing that kind of signage? Does it have to be wood or, or uplit or something like that? So, I mean, we can get really granular, and we don't have to do that right now. I don't want us to do that right now.
No.
But just in a general sense, you know what I mean?
Well, I think one of the things that I see is FATE, F8, right? That, Victoria and them came up with, for Fate Creamery. Building on that with a logo somehow in the downtown area, I think is kind of cool, right? It makes it a little more unique. Maybe it's a small logo on the bottom of the sign that shows. But, I mean, lots of room for conversation.
Okay. All right. Well, thanks. I really appreciate your input on all of that. That's going to be helpful to us. So, anyway, here are the modules. We've got in internal drafts of Module 1. Right now, those are some of our early fixes that we're working on. Right now, we're in the middle of Module 2, which again is what we presented to you tonight. That was what Felix showed you with the block length standards, those sorts of things, the 4 things I presented, and some technical work on the floodplain overlay that I know Brennan's folks are working on. And then Module 3 is things that relate more directly to the IDA's audit that you heard earlier, which are our downtown design, mixed-use districts, some revisions to the use table, and then the two big land hogs, landscaping and parking, all of which will add up to a more productive city. And so anything that, again, everything you heard tonight was something that's designed to make development more productive financially for the city, which is what the plan calls for. Next slide, please. And so again, Module 2 we're working on now. We're hoping to have a complete draft in June. Module 3 we're going to work on in July and August, get a consolidated draft together in December, and then adoption looking at November and December for the UDC. So you're for the UDO. Some of my clients call it the code, and some of them call it an ordinance. So it's the UDO. So you'll start to see and have an opportunity to start commenting on some of the specific code language related to all this here shortly. So next, any other questions or discussion as we go forward? If not, I appreciate everybody's input tonight. Was somebody about to say something?
No, this was good.
Okay, thank you.
Thank
No,
you for your time.
we appreciate the time.
You bet. It's a fun project and a great community to work in, so I really appreciate it and appreciate all of your comments tonight. So
It's the best
thank you very
community.
Thank you very much, Mark. Thank you, Felix.
All right.
Thank you,
guys.
Brennan.
Thanks, everybody.